There was a conversation that took place between two of the most powerful men in the Allied command during World War II, and what was said in that conversation would change the course of the war in Europe. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, who had stood defiant against the Nazi war machine when all of Europe had fallen, sat across from George S. Patton, the American general whose reputation for aggressive warfare was already legendary. And in that moment, Patton revealed something to Churchill that would explain why his Third Army would accomplish what many military experts believed was impossible. He told Churchill a philosophy of warfare so radical, so completely opposite to traditional military thinking, that it would allow him to advance his army 400 miles across France in just 30 days, liberating territory faster than any force in military history. He told Churchill why he would never stop, why he would never consolidate defensive positions, why he would push his men and machines to the absolute breaking point and beyond. And Churchill, who understood the brutal mathematics of warfare better than almost anyone alive, immediately grasped why this American general was about to become unstoppable. This is the story of Patton's secret, the tactical philosophy that made him different from every other Allied commander, and why his methods won the war faster than anyone thought possible. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about World War II. Before I tell you exactly what Patton said to Churchill, you need to understand who George S. Patton really was, because his entire life had been preparing him for the role he would play in World War II. This wasn't a general who learned his tactics from textbooks and staff colleges. This was a warrior who had studied warfare since childhood with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Patton was born into a military family in California in 1885, and from his earliest years he was immersed in military history. He didn't just read about famous battles, he memorized them. He studied the campaigns of Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Napoleon Bonaparte, and every other great military commander in history. He analyzed their tactics, understood their thinking, and absorbed their lessons until they became part of his own military instinct. But Patton's education went far beyond books. He was a natural athlete who competed in the 1912 Stockholm Olympics in the modern pentathlon, which included pistol shooting, fencing, swimming, horseback riding, and cross-country running. He finished 5th overall despite a controversial scoring decision in the shooting competition, where he was penalized for what may have been a perfect shot that went through an existing hole in the target. The pentathlon wasn't just a sport to Patton. It was training for the kind of combat he believed a cavalry officer needed to master. Every skill in the pentathlon was something a warrior might need on the battlefield. The mental toughness required to compete at the Olympic level, the physical conditioning, the ability to perform under pressure when exhausted, all of this would serve him later when he commanded armies. Patton saw his first combat in 1916 during the punitive expedition into Mexico, chasing the revolutionary Pancho Villa. This expedition marked the first motorized attack in United States military history, and Patton was right in the middle of it. Leading a small force of 10 soldiers and 2 guides in 3 Dodge touring cars, Patton surprised 3 of Villa's men during a foraging expedition. The gunfight that followed left 3 enemy fighters dead, and while it was never entirely clear if Patton personally killed all of them, he was known to have wounded all 3. The incident earned him the nickname Bandit Killer and brought him widespread media attention. More importantly, it taught him something crucial about warfare. Speed and surprise could overcome superior numbers and defensive positions. A small, fast-moving force that struck without warning could accomplish what a larger, slower force could not. When World War I erupted, Patton went to France and quickly became one of the U.S. Army's leading experts on the new weapon that was revolutionizing warfare, the tank. He established the American Expeditionary Force's first tank school, training crews and developing tactics for armored warfare. He personally led tanks into combat during the Meuse-Argonne offensive in September 1918, walking ahead of his tanks to direct their fire and keep them moving forward. When he was wounded by machine gun fire, he continued directing operations until he collapsed from blood loss. This moment revealed something essential about Patton's character. He wasn't the kind of general who commanded from the rear. He led from the front, exposing himself to the same dangers his men faced, demonstrating the aggressive forward movement he would demand from them. Between the wars, while other officers settled into peacetime routines, Patton continued studying armored warfare with obsessive intensity. He studied the German military theorists who were developing blitzkrieg tactics. He understood that the next war would be different from World War I's static trench warfare. The next war would be about speed, mobility, and breakthrough. Tanks wouldn't just support infantry. They would lead the attack, punching through enemy lines and exploiting the breakthrough before the enemy could react. This was revolutionary thinking in an American military establishment that was still focused on infantry tactics and defensive warfare. When World War II began, and Patton finally got his chance to command armored forces in combat, he brought all of this knowledge, all of this preparation, all of this aggressive warrior mentality to bear. In North Africa, fighting against Rommel's Afrika Korps, Patton took command of forces that had been demoralized by earlier defeats and transformed them into an aggressive, confident army. His methods were unconventional and controversial. He insisted on strict discipline regarding uniforms and military appearance, believing that soldiers who looked professional would act professional. He imposed fines for not wearing helmets or ties, for having dirty rifles, for any violation of military standards. His officers thought he was crazy to care about such details in combat, but Patton understood something they didn't. Discipline in small things created discipline in big things. An army that maintained standards under fire was an army that could be trusted to fight when things got desperate. But it was his tactical philosophy that made Patton different from every other Allied commander. And it was this philosophy that he explained to Churchill during their conversations. While other generals believed in careful, methodical advances, in consolidating positions and establishing secure supply lines before moving forward, Patton believed in relentless, continuous, offensive action. His motto was simple and uncompromising. Go forward, go forward, go forward. There's no reason to stop. There's no reason to consolidate. There's no reason to wait. This wasn't recklessness. This was a carefully developed tactical philosophy based on Patton's study of military history and his understanding of how wars were won. The core of Patton's philosophy was this: constant forward movement saved lives. This seems counterintuitive. You would think that rushing forward, that pushing men and equipment to their limits without pause, would result in higher casualties. But Patton had studied enough military history to know the opposite was true. When you attacked relentlessly, when you gave the enemy no time to organize a defense, no time to bring up reinforcements, no time to dig in, you reduced your own casualties because the enemy was always off balance, always retreating, always unable to mount an effective resistance. The longer you gave an enemy to prepare, the more your own soldiers would die when you finally attacked. Speed saved lives, aggression saved lives, constant forward movement saved lives. Patton used a phrase that captured his entire tactical approach: grab them by the nose and kick them in the pants. What he meant was this: pin the enemy in place with a frontal attack that held their attention, then hit them from an unexpected direction with your main force. Find the enemy's weak point, attack it with overwhelming force and speed, break through, then exploit that breakthrough as rapidly as possible. Don't stop to consolidate. Don't worry about your flanks. Keep pushing deeper into enemy territory, disrupting their communications, destroying their supply lines, creating chaos and panic. A fast-moving attacker created more problems for the enemy than they could solve. A static defender, no matter how well prepared, eventually had to deal with supply shortages, low morale, and uncertainty about what was happening beyond their immediate position. When Patton explained this philosophy to Churchill, the Prime Minister understood immediately why it would work. Churchill had spent years watching the British and Allied forces grind slowly forward in North Africa and Italy, fighting for every mile, taking heavy casualties against German forces that had time to prepare defensive positions. He had seen how traditional military tactics produced slow, bloody campaigns that dragged on for months. And here was this American general telling him that the secret to winning faster wasn't better equipment or more troops. It was speed. It was aggression. It was refusing to give the enemy any breathing room whatsoever. Churchill also understood the psychological aspect of Patton's tactics. War wasn't just about killing enemy soldiers and destroying equipment. War was about breaking the enemy's will to fight. A defending army that constantly retreated, that never had time to rest or reorganize, that watched their positions being overrun faster than they could establish new ones, would eventually collapse psychologically. Soldiers who felt they were losing would stop fighting effectively. Officers who felt their situation was hopeless would make mistakes. An army in constant retreat was an army headed toward defeat, and the faster you pushed them, the faster they would break. In Churchill's diary entry about his conversation with Patton, he noted that Patton had simply told the truth about his tactical philosophy. Churchill defended Patton when other Allied commanders criticized his aggressive methods, because Churchill understood that Patton's approach, while unconventional and sometimes controversial, was actually the most effective way to win the war in Europe. When Eisenhower faced political pressure to relieve Patton of command after various incidents, Churchill intervened, making it clear that he believed Patton was too valuable to lose. The Prime Minister knew that no other Allied general had Patton's combination of tactical brilliance and aggressive execution. Now let me show you exactly how Patton's philosophy worked in practice, because the proof wasn't in theories or speeches. The proof was in what his Third Army accomplished when it finally got unleashed on the battlefield. On August 1st, 1944, Patton's Third Army became operational in Normandy, France. For weeks, Allied forces had been grinding through the Norman hedgerows, making slow, costly progress against determined German resistance. The breakout from the D-Day beachhead had been brutal and bloody. Miles were measured in yards, and every field was bought with American and British blood. This was exactly the kind of warfare Patton despised. Static, defensive-minded, attritional warfare that played to German strengths. When Patton's Third Army entered the battle, everything changed. Within just 2 weeks, his forces had driven to the coast of Brittany, cutting off German forces and opening ports for Allied shipping. Then, his army turned 90 degrees and began racing east across France. What happened next stunned everyone, including the Germans. In 30 days, Patton's Third Army advanced 400 miles across France. To put that in perspective, no army in history had ever advanced that far that fast while fighting a determined enemy. The German army that had conquered France in 1940 with their vaunted blitzkrieg tactics had taken longer to cover the same ground, and they had faced a French army that was already collapsing. Patton was advancing against German forces that were still organized, still fighting, still dangerous. And he was beating them so badly that entire German divisions were being destroyed or captured. How did he do it? He implemented every aspect of the philosophy he had explained to Churchill. His forces moved continuously, day and night. When advance units ran low on fuel or ammunition, they didn't stop and wait for supplies. They requisitioned fuel from French civilians, captured German supply dumps, borrowed supplies from other Allied units when necessary. Patton's philosophy was that it was better to apologize later than to stop moving forward. His armored columns pushed deep into enemy territory, often outrunning their own supply lines, because Patton understood that the damage they were doing to German rear areas, the disruption they were causing, was worth the risk. German commanders couldn't figure out where Patton's forces were going to strike next, because Patton himself was making decisions based on opportunities that appeared in real time. Patton pioneered the use of forward air controllers embedded with his ground forces, coordinating tactical air support in ways that had never been done before. His Third Army headquarters had more staff dedicated to coordinating airstrikes than any other Allied formation. Fighter bombers flew cover over his advancing columns, providing what he called armored column cover, with 3 to 4 P-47 or P-51 fighters coordinating with ground forces to destroy any German resistance that appeared. This integration of ground and air power was revolutionary. While other armies used air support to soften targets before ground attacks, Patton used air support as an integral part of continuous movement. His columns didn't stop to wait for artillery to destroy an enemy position. They called in airstrikes and kept moving. The secret to Patton's speed wasn't just technology or tactics. It was his understanding of what modern military theorists now call the tempo of operations. He pushed his forces so fast that German commanders couldn't react effectively. By the time German headquarters realized Patton had broken through at one location, he had already advanced 20 or 30 miles beyond that point and was threatening 3 other locations. German reinforcements rushed to block what they thought was Patton's main axis of advance, only to discover he had changed direction and was attacking somewhere else entirely. This created a cascading series of problems for the German commanders. They were always reacting to what Patton had done yesterday, never able to predict or prevent what he was going to do tomorrow. One of the most remarkable aspects of Patton's advance across France was how he used terrain to his advantage. While planning his routes, Patton carried with him a worn copy of Julius Caesar's The Gallic Wars, written nearly 2,000 years earlier. When asked about this unusual reference material, Patton said, with his characteristic blunt humor, that old bold Roman was one of the best in world history at reading terrain, and valleys and rivers still run in the same directions they did in Caesar's time. By understanding how Caesar had moved armies through the same regions centuries before, Patton could identify routes that allowed rapid movement, find places where rivers could be forded, anticipate where defensive positions would be strong or weak. This combination of ancient military wisdom and modern armored warfare gave Patton advantages that other commanders lacked. The German commanders who fought against Patton's Third Army later admitted they had never faced anything like it. When interrogated after the war, General Heinz Guderian, the Wehrmacht's foremost tank warfare expert and one of the architects of Blitzkrieg, stated, "I must congratulate Patton on his victory, since he acted as I would have done had I been in his place." General Gunther Blumentritt said, "We regarded General Patton extremely highly as the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies. His operations impressed us enormously, probably because he came closest to our own concept of the classical military commander. He even improved on Napoleon's basic tenet of speed and activity." These were not compliments from defeated men trying to make excuses. These were professional assessments from experienced military commanders who understood exactly how difficult it was to do what Patton had done. The Germans were particularly impressed and terrified by how Patton's forces seemed to be everywhere at once. His advance units would appear in locations that German intelligence had assessed as impossible to reach that quickly. Supply officers would report that American forces had captured supply dumps that were supposed to be safely behind the front lines. Communication centers would go silent because Patton's tanks had overrun them. The psychological impact on German troops was devastating. They began to believe that Patton's army was unstoppable, that no defensive position could hold against him, that retreat was the only option. This psychological warfare was exactly what Patton intended. He wanted the enemy to be demoralized, to be constantly off balance, to feel that resisting was futile. But Patton's greatest demonstration of his tactical philosophy came during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. The Germans launched their last major offensive, a desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. They attacked through the Ardennes forest, catching American forces by surprise and creating a massive bulge in the Allied lines. The situation was desperate. American units were surrounded at Bastogne, a critical road junction that the Germans needed to capture to continue their offensive. If Bastogne fell, the German breakthrough might succeed. Every Allied commander knew that reinforcements had to reach Bastogne immediately, but the challenge seemed impossible. Patton's Third Army was over 100 miles away, engaged in offensive operations along the German border, facing in completely the wrong direction. When Eisenhower called his commanders together to figure out how to respond to the German offensive, he asked when forces could be redirected to attack the southern flank of the German penetration. Most commanders said it would take weeks to disengage, turn their armies around, and mount a coordinated offensive. Patton shocked everyone by saying he could attack in 3 days with 3 divisions. The other commanders thought he was either joking or insane. You couldn't turn an entire army 90 degrees, move it over 100 miles through winter weather, and launch a coordinated offensive in 3 days. It was impossible, except Patton had already planned for exactly this scenario. His intelligence officer, Oscar Koch, had been warning for weeks that the Germans might attack through the Ardennes, and Patton had quietly prepared contingency plans without telling anyone. He had studied the maps, identified the routes his units would take, determined which divisions would move where, calculated how long it would take. When the attack came, Patton already knew what he was going to do. All he had to do was give the orders and execute. Within 72 hours, elements of Patton's Third Army had traveled 150 miles through winter storms, turned 90 degrees from their original axis of advance, and launched a coordinated attack on the southern flank of the German Bulge. Within 4 days, they had broken the siege of Bastogne. This was the fastest large-scale redeployment and offensive operation in military history. No other commander in World War II could have done it. No other army had the training, discipline, and aggressive mindset to execute such a maneuver under those conditions. Patton himself described his planning meeting with Bradley before the offensive, telling him, "Brad, this time the Kraut stuck his head in the meat grinder, and I've got hold of the handle." When Bradley suggested Patton should attack toward Koblenz to cut off the base of the German Bulge and trap all the attacking forces, Patton argued that he needed to relieve Bastogne first, then pursue the retreating Germans. He understood that the immediate tactical goal was saving the surrounded American forces, but his instinct was to turn the German offensive into a complete disaster for them. Every day they spent in the Bulge, exposed to Allied air power and flanking attacks, was another day closer to their complete destruction. Patton wanted to keep them in the fight long enough to kill or capture all of them, rather than letting them retreat to fight another day. This mentality, this focus on destroying the enemy rather than just pushing them back, was another key aspect of Patton's philosophy that Churchill understood and appreciated. The goal of warfare wasn't to capture territory. The goal was to destroy the enemy's ability to fight. Every German soldier killed or captured, every tank destroyed, every supply dump captured was one less thing the Allies would have to face later. Patton's relentless offensive operations weren't just about moving forward. They were about systematically destroying the German army's capacity to resist. When his forces captured a town, they didn't just secure it and move on. They rounded up every German soldier, confiscated every weapon, requisitioned every vehicle, and left nothing behind that could be used to slow the Allied advance. The statistics from Patton's campaigns tell the story better than anything else. In just 281 days of combat operations, from August 1944 to May 1945, Patton's Third Army advanced further than any army in military history. They liberated or conquered over 81,500 square miles of territory. They captured over 1,200,000 enemy soldiers. They inflicted over 500,000 enemy casualties. They destroyed or captured over 3,000 enemy tanks and assault guns. And they did all of this while suffering relatively lower casualties than other Allied armies engaged in the same campaigns. Patton's philosophy of constant offensive action, of never giving the enemy time to prepare defenses, of maintaining relentless pressure, resulted in exactly what he had predicted: faster victory with lower friendly casualties. But there was a cost to Patton's methods that Churchill also understood. Patton pushed his men and equipment to the absolute breaking point, and sometimes beyond. His supply officers performed miracles, keeping his forces fueled and armed while advancing at speeds that outran normal supply operations. His maintenance crews worked around the clock, keeping vehicles running when they should have been in depots for major repairs. His soldiers fought when they were exhausted, when they should have been resting, when every muscle screamed for sleep. This was the price of Patton's speed. He demanded more from his forces than any other commander, and his forces delivered because they believed in him, because they trusted his methods, because they saw the results. The secret that Patton told Churchill wasn't really a secret at all. It was a fundamental truth about warfare that most commanders were afraid to embrace. Speed wins wars. Aggression wins wars. Relentless offensive action that never gives the enemy time to recover wins wars. But implementing this truth required a rare combination of tactical brilliance, psychological insight, leadership charisma, and sheer physical courage. Patton had to lead from the front, had to expose himself to danger, had to demonstrate to his men that he would ask nothing of them that he wouldn't do himself. When his troops saw Patton standing in the turret of his jeep, well within range of enemy artillery, his ivory-handled pistols on his hips, his face set in grim determination, they understood that this general wasn't going to let anything stop the advance. If Patton was willing to risk his life to keep moving forward, then they would do the same. Churchill recognized in Patton something that was rare in the Allied command structure. Most generals were administrators, managers, planners who commanded from the rear and made decisions based on careful analysis of intelligence reports and logistics estimates. Patton was a warrior who commanded from the front and made decisions based on instinct, opportunity, and an aggressive desire to close with the enemy and destroy him. Churchill himself was a warrior at heart, despite his role as a political leader. He had fought in combat as a young man, had written about warfare, had studied military history his entire life. He understood what Patton was saying because he thought the same way. The difference was that Churchill was running a nation at war, dealing with political considerations and alliance management, while Patton could focus entirely on the operational level of warfare. When Churchill defended Patton against critics within the Allied command, when he told Eisenhower that Patton had simply told the truth, he was defending not just a controversial general, but a philosophy of warfare that Churchill believed was essential to winning the war. The British had been fighting since 1939. They had endured the Blitz, the North Africa campaigns, the slow, grinding advance through Italy. They had seen how cautious, methodical warfare produced slow results and high casualties. They needed what Patton offered, a way to win faster, to end the war sooner, to stop the dying. Churchill understood that Patton's methods, while sometimes brutal and controversial, were actually the most humane approach because they shortened the war. The final proof of Patton's tactical genius came in how quickly the war in Europe ended once his Third Army was unleashed. From the breakout at Normandy in August 1944 to the German surrender in May 1945, less than 9 months passed. Compare this to the previous war, where American forces fought in France for over a year and still hadn't broken through the German lines when the armistice was signed. Compare this to the Italian campaign, where Allied forces took nearly 2 years to advance the length of Italy against German forces that were never more than a fraction of the forces defending France. Patton's aggressive tactics, his philosophy of continuous offensive action, his refusal to consolidate or pause, compressed the timeline of the European war by months or possibly years. Think about what that means in human terms. Every month the war continued meant tens of thousands more casualties. It meant more cities destroyed, more civilians killed, more concentration camps operating, more suffering. By winning faster, Patton saved lives on both sides. This was the ultimate vindication of his tactical philosophy. The critics who said his methods were too aggressive, too risky, too demanding on his troops were wrong. The cautious approach that other generals favored would have resulted in a longer war and more deaths. Patton's approach shortened the war and saved lives. This was what Churchill understood when Patton explained his philosophy. This was why Churchill defended him. This was why history remembers Patton as one of the great military commanders. Today, military academies around the world study Patton's campaigns. His emphasis on speed and aggression has influenced modern military doctrine in every advanced military force. The first Gulf War in 1991 was planned and executed using principles that Patton pioneered: rapid armored advances, deep penetration of enemy lines, integration of ground and air forces, maintaining constant pressure on a retreating enemy. The nickname given to that campaign, Operation Desert Storm, could just as easily have described Patton's advance across France. The Second Iraq War in 2003 saw similar tactics: a rapid drive to Baghdad that bypassed enemy strongpoints and kept Iraqi forces off balance. These modern campaigns succeeded for the same reasons Patton's campaign succeeded. Speed and aggression overwhelmed the enemy's ability to respond effectively. But Patton's legacy goes beyond tactical innovations. He proved something fundamental about warfare and leadership. He proved that aggressive, decisive action beats cautious, methodical planning. He proved that the will to win, the refusal to accept anything less than total victory, could overcome superior numbers or defensive positions. He proved that leadership meant being willing to take risks, to trust your instincts, to push forward even when others said it was impossible. These lessons apply far beyond military operations. They apply to any competitive endeavor where someone is trying to achieve a difficult goal against opposition. The conversation between Patton and Churchill, where Patton explained his tactical philosophy and Churchill recognized its brilliance, represents one of the crucial moments of World War II. It was the moment when the aggressive, offensive-minded American approach to warfare gained the backing of Britain's most important leader. It was the moment when Churchill decided that Patton was too valuable to lose, that his methods were too effective to question, that the Allied cause needed his particular brand of aggressive warfare. Without Churchill's support, Patton might have been relieved of command during one of his various controversies. Without Patton's Third Army, the war in Europe would have lasted longer and cost more lives. Together, these two warriors, one commanding armies on the battlefield and one commanding a nation at war, formed a partnership that helped win the war faster than anyone thought possible. Now I want to hear from you. Did you know about Patton's tactical philosophy before watching this video? Does it change how you think about World War II strategy? Understanding how great military leaders thought and operated gives us insights that go far beyond military history. These are lessons about leadership, about decision-making under pressure, about the courage to act decisively when others hesitate. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, make sure you're subscribed to this channel so you don't miss our next incredible World War II story. And please watch this video all the way through and leave a comment below. We need to hit 100 comments to continue bringing you more inspiring stories like this one. Your engagement literally keeps this channel alive and allows us to keep telling these important stories. Tell me what surprised you most about Patton's approach to warfare. And if you want, tell me from which part of the world you're watching this video. Your comment matters, and I want to read it and reply. For more exciting stories like this one, click on the video appearing on your screen right now.